podcast where you get practical, no BS insights on how to grow yourself and grow your career. On this episode, we're talking to Mike Phillips. I'm so excited to have you here, Mike. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Britta. It's a pleasure.
Well, this has been sort of a long time coming, a conversation. We've known each other for a while, but I'm just so excited for everybody to hear your perspective on, getting stuck in your career and how to shift into an empowered sort of career iteration mindset. And we'd like to get started by just knowing a little bit about you. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself so that we get a sense of who you are?
Sure. So where I am today. So I'm Mike Phillips. I currently am employed as the Senior Growth Marketing Manager at a software company called 1220. We serve university career centers and employer recruiters who are trying to find really good early career talent. At the same time, I run a brand called Marketing Muscle. It's my personal brand, but I also have products and community now that I'll be launching, and I'm running all of these in parallel to each other.
It's crazy life.
it can be. And so, yeah, the Marketing Muscle thing came out of my personal brand. My office right here is attached to my gym right there. It's the same room.
I love
And
it.
I see the growth that happens in both places. And I'd love to dig more into that and the journey that led me to where I stand today.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to dig into that journey. So let's start. You told us a little bit about yourself, what's currently going on, but I want to start this story by having you just tell us sort of the A to B from here to there, where you started and how you got to where you are, just very briefly, and then we can dig into the topic and how that relates to how you got to where you are.
Sure. Oh my gosh. Okay. So Reader's Digest version of the crooked path that I took. So when I was 16, 17, I was 100% sure I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a mechanical engineer.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a mechanical engineer today. So, but I went to university and I studied mechanical engineering. While there, I realized it wasn't. I loved the story of what engineering could do and how it could affect things, but I didn't love the work of specking out how many horsepower a pump needed to be to move salt water uphill and like all the things that they do. So I wound up getting my degree is now in mathematics. That was just the nearest peripheral topic that I wound up getting. And then I wound up falling back on a skill set that I kind of just learned from my grandfather, who was a mentor and a big influence in my life. And he was a lifelong salesperson. So I wound up leaving school and I went and I learned how to sell things. I did commissioned retail sales. I sold appliances, like the most basic. So I did that. And from there, I just went from retail, I went to wholesale, and then I went to sales management, started managing a territory. I'm trying to keep it short for you, Britta. And then
Great job.
And then I got an opportunity to manage sales and marketing combined at a startup. And that was kind of where the marketing bug bit me, where I first was exposed to it. And I was like, ooh, this is my thing. I started consulting with it. And then I started doing strategic brand strategy at larger software companies, and then moved into revenue growth, which is where my role is now.
And you're so great at it. I love the way that, your posts, I love the way you so strategically approach, one, how to build a personal brand, which is so interesting. It seems very fluffy, building a personal brand, but you approach it in very practical steps. So I always appreciate that about your content. So if you guys haven't followed Marketing Muscle, go to Mike's profile, click the little bell, follow it. It's, great insights every day. But so let's start to talk about, when did you feel stuck and how did you break free from that? Let's discuss that concept a little bit of feeling stuck in your professional journey and how that impacted you.
Sure. I'm just thinking there were, and I think if we all think back, there are many instances when you get mired,
Yeah.
It was, the early one was like when I was in university and I was sitting there and I was like, yeah, I had that moment of like, I like what the problem in the textbook is talking about. But when you start doing like internships and things, you start realizing you're like, oh, I don't ever touch that. I am one of many people who are solving a component of this problem. And then I get a spec from one person and I hand it on to somebody else. And I think it's hard sometimes when you're in a moment like that to know what the new destination should be, especially if you were somebody who is a person of vision, right? And you chart a course to something that you've set, that you're like, oh, I see myself doing this. And then you kind of learn something along the way that you're like, that thing that I saw myself doing isn't the thing you do when you get there.
Right. There's like such a disconnect. You want to make that impact, and you're not seeing that with the final product and how you're involved.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not a failure of imagination or intelligence or aptitude when you experience that, because oftentimes, like, we have to make decisions with incomplete information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so if, it's not a flaw to do that. And I think a lot of times people need to kind of embrace that imperfect decision-making process. So what I fall back on, like, there's an old quote. It's old. I mean, I'm not old, but like there's an old quote of like, I think it was Colin Powell or whatever. And he said that the best time to take action in a mission is when you know between 40 and 70% of all the information that
Oh, wow.
so the
Wait,
theory.
I love that. The best time to take action is when you know between 40 and 70% of the information you need. I love
Yes.
that.
And there's reasoning. The reasoning is less than 40, you're being impulsive, and there's a higher risk of unexpected challenge.
Mm.
More than 70, you are waiting for a perfection that then what happens is circumstances change and the earlier bit of information you knew becomes outdated. And so then you're behind the ball because you've waited to close the gap, and the things you thought you had shored up, circumstances have changed.
Wow.
So
okay, this is blowing my mind already, Mike. We're only like 6 minutes in. Come on.
this applies to any brand you're building, whether it's your personal career brand or for a business. The same thing applies. And that's where like the term like being nimble comes in. So like when you're stuck, whether I was in the career point or I was like sitting in sales trying to determine if I wanted to stay in sales my whole life, you don't have to know 100% of what comes next. You can know between 40 and 70% of what comes next and make the best informed choice you can. And that's one of the best ways to get unstuck, is I think realizing perfection is not required, right? 40 to 70% in school grades is not passing in a lot of places. Like, but in life, it works, and there's no cheating. There's no letter grade for your life career path. There's simply, your subjective satisfaction with what
I love this. This 40 and 70% sort of idea really relates to me to this problem that we see often, where people will read a job description and who know, like, I've read so many job descriptions where I'm like, I don't even know what that means. Okay. Like,
right.
I don't even know if I'm still qualified for this. And so when you read a job description and you can glean that you're at least 60 to 70% qualified or know what the job entails, then you should absolutely apply. That's sort of how this
Yes.
applies to me. But I love that this is applying to sort of a broader idea of how are you pursuing your career? How are you knowing what your next step is? 40 to 70% of the information, you get
Right.
to the next step.
That is absolutely, that job description thing is exactly the way I wound up applying it in a lot of cases. And I do know that there's a lot of like systemic stuff that is out there where, like, I know, like, in general, like my wife and I were just talking about this, that women are less likely to apply for jobs they don't meet all the criteria for compared to their male counterparts that are otherwise equally qualified. Right? So this is an opportunity for, I think, a lot of people to kind of open their mind a little bit on what they apply for. And that's how I made all my pivots. Imagine somebody, and if you're in the shoes of, at the time I had like half of a degree, in engineering, which you can't do engineering without a full degree. You have to be, completely credentialed. So then I'm like, okay, I can finish mathematics. And then like, okay, I know mathematics. Sales is kind of the most meritocratic profession.
Yeah.
But I was able to discuss, leadership and persuasion that I had to do in projects to say that I had skills that were transferable to sales. And I met about 40% of the criteria. I didn't sell anything before, and in a role, like I didn't have an actual paid job for selling before I got my first job for selling.
Wow. Yeah.
But the irony is the kind of meta thing is you sell yourself into the job to sell things. There's a little bit of that, right?
Yeah.
But, and then same thing, like when I went to do marketing, I had never done marketing. I said, but I had done high volume sales, and I talked about merchandising and how the visual presentation helped make sales easier, and making sure the campaign that is around you in marketing is what you align your sales efforts to for less friction. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, you understand aptitudinally, you understand what it takes to
Right.
do marketing.
Right.
And then, so again, 40 to 70% of the job description, and I worked well and did into that. And then each step you take, you say, okay, I'm about 60% qualified. I'm going to learn that gap while doing
Yeah.
the job. I'll get paid to learn it.
Yeah.
And then you continue growing on that into the next role or the next pivot. And that's how you keep yourself from getting stuck.
See, I love this too. There's another thing I think that happens in terms of like qualifications and phenomenon in applying for jobs is people will look at a job description, they'll be like, "Oh, I'm 100% qualified for this. I know how to do everything." They get to the job and then they're bored.
Yeah.
And they hate it because they're not learning anything. They're not growing. They didn't account for the fact that like they need to progress, and that's part of being human. You need that forward momentum to
Indeed. A
engage.
job should do two things for you. You should earn or learn, and ideally both.
I love it. Yeah. So if you see a job description and you wouldn't be earning more for information you already know, don't apply. If you see a job description and you are, not fully qualified, but it's maybe not in the greatest price range, you're still going to be learning and it's going to grow your
Right.
skill set and keep you going. So, okay. So I love, you've said this to me before. You've talked about, when people have had a breakdown or when things have had a breakdown, things feel overwhelming. You said instead of backtracking, pick the next right step. Can you just talk a little bit about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's another one of the so much of, I think, whether we feel stuck or not, it operates in our own heads as opposed to environmental. Like there are real structures and things around us that affect progress. But I think there are ways in which we can respond to the environment, And so when I think about whether we're backtracking or taking the next right step, when you're stuck, like let's go to a metaphor that's more physical, right? So like let's say you're walking on a path and then you step in and there's like mud and like you're on hiking and there's a muddy path, right? Your boots are going to get stuck and you're looking, you're like, I probably can't go forward anymore because I'm going to get more stuck or I'm going to wind up just being mired here. And so you have choices, right? So you're like, okay, I'm physically stuck. My boots are suctioned into the mud right now. I can literally turn around and go back the way I came and abandoned all of the directional awareness and progress that I've made. Or you can look for what is the next right step. And I mean that in the sense of you wind up having to shorten your field of view from this over the horizon destination that you couldn't physically see but you were envisioning and the compass is pointing you in this direction. Shorten it up to, okay, what's the next right thing? I'm not physically able to go do what I thought I did, but maybe there's a dry patch of dirt to stand on there. It's forward, it's the next, it may be sideways. It's not necessarily, but as soon as you have to readjust your targeting. So I think sometimes, especially people who are extremely focused or are really good at like intrinsically motivated people, the double-edged sword of that is you can make yourself do anything. You don't need a micromanager. The downside of that is you're your own worst enemy sometimes because you're driving yourself towards what exactly you're trying to see. And you're like, no, I set that goal. It's up to me. I will do it. But your boots are stuck in the mud. So you're like, no, I'm gonna shorten my goal because I have permission to do that. There's no rules in life. There's no syllabus I'm following.
Thank goodness, right?
I'm going to shorten my vision up and say that dry spot is where I'm going to step next. And then next to it, you're like, oh, there's a rock. Or there's a tree limb. Maybe I'll climb a tree. I'm hiking, but maybe climbing a tree is the new thing that I'm going to do. And so
I love this analogy because it speaks to sort of this idea of experimentation and iteration. So like you're saying, maybe I can't take a step forward, but there's a step to the left that's a dry patch of grass where I can reevaluate. So let's discuss sort of the benefits of this idea of deliberately non-structured time to experiment in your career and life. How has this, reflect on this? You have sort of this engineering mindset. Help us reflect on how this iteration process works.
Right. I like that you brought up experimentation because like that is the process that's taking place on that muddy trail analogy, right? So it winds, and maybe it's a background because again, I was grounded in a STEM field was like my educational background, but I think anyone, whether you studied it or not, can understand the concept of creating a hypothesis of like, I think this should happen, and then doing the things that will either invalidate it or validate it. right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And that's the scientific process of iterating. Like you want to test. And scientifically, actually, the best thing that you wind up doing is you wind up trying to deliberately invalidate your hypothesis.
Ooh,
Because
yeah.
so you're like, oh, 2 + 2 is 4 is a hypothesis. So I'm going to do something that if I'm going to say, okay, well, if I take 2 beans and I add the 2 beans to that pile, if I get anything other than 4 in that pile, I've proven myself wrong. But despite
Ooh.
but despite my best efforts, every time I put 2 beans together, 2 strawberries together, 2 AirPods together, and no matter how I do it, I can't fail. I can't make my hypothesis fail.
Mm.
Therefore, it must be true, despite my best efforts. And there's more complicated ways to get into like mathematics of that. But
Okay,
like,
this is such a great example because for me, like I have these preset ideas of like I'm not good at sales or I can't do X or I know I wouldn't like doing Y, and like I like the idea of deliberately challenging the thing that you don't think you might be good at and
right,
experimenting with it, testing it out. And I found, I'm not great at being a sales shark, but I am great at selling into an existing contract. Like
nice,
I am great at supporting that customer relationship. And I wouldn't have known that had I been like, well, I'm not going to do anything involving sales because I know I don't like it. You know,
right.
it's that idea of sort of testing out. How has that taken place in your life? Like tell me about examples where you've sort of tested things out and you found this process. Also, one more point I want to make. What I really love about the scientific process is you don't feel bad. It's just
Exactly.
information. Like, it's not like, "Oh, I'm totally silly, like, I'm a jerk because I thought that 2 plus 2 would equal 5, and I've proven it wrong." Like, you don't
Right.
feel bad about that. So
It's funny you mentioned sales, and it reminds me like so that I learned sales like from my grandfather, but I did it professionally after engineering. And I remember like no is the second best answer you can get,
ooh, yes.
right? In sales and marketing or any business venture, and like, applying for a job, no is the second best answer you can get. The worst thing is no answer, which we can go down a whole rabbit hole of being ghosted on like jobs and sales and all of that. But if somebody gets to a no, you've learned, and usually you can say, cool, no problem, we'll still be friends. I understand this. And like it is information. And I think the scientific mindset kind of supports that. And unstructured time gives you room to think up these experiments.
Ooh.
So that's when I say, like, it's very easy to optimize our life for, oh, I'm going to network this. I'm going to be on LinkedIn for this time. I'm going to go to this event. I'm going to do a professional development course. I'm going to do a side project. I'm going to build a portfolio, and I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to wake up and do it again. And then all of a sudden, you've left no space in your day for innovating. And
Mhm.
innovating does not happen with a linear, it's not calculation. It's not using a calculator.
Yeah.
It's what formula do you want to use in the calculator.
Mm, yeah.
It's not like just using chat gpt, it's designing the prompt to get the best out of chat gpt. So like that sort of brain space does not follow linear processes. And so you need to leave, or I find, and this is like Steve Jobs was famous for this, structuring a non-negotiable chunk of your day, if you're a time
Ooh.
blocker, to let your brain come up with what are the experimentative, innovative things that I need to do to keep myself moving forward, to get unstuck, or to find the next step that's unexpected, to connect those dots in random ways.
Yes, I think not only should we structure that into our day, I feel like in any business that's trying to be innovative, they should mandate that for their employees. I mean, you think about
Yeah,
Google AdWords was created by a individual contributor who just had this wild, wacky idea, like, what if we did this? And
good
it's made the
example.
company billions of dollars. So, like, what I don't understand is why do you think that employers are so, and this is maybe a little bit of a question out of our realm, but I'd love to hear your reflection on this. Why do you think employers are so worried to give people unstructured time? What do you think that's about?
I don't, I think it comes down to culture at an
Mm,
organization. And ironically, much like a brand, culture is a distributed identity.
yeah.
So when we think about a company's brand or their culture, it lives in all the people that carry it. And like if you have a
Ooh.
if you have a brand as a business, it lives between you and your audience, or between you and your customers.
Yes.
It's not what we tell our employees to think about a company that makes its culture. It's what they tell each other about the company. Customers are the same way. Our brand with a customer is not what we tell them to think about us. It's what they're telling each other that they think about us. We can be part of those conversations, right?
Yeah.
We can be like, as the business, as an employer brand, as a selling brand, like we can be in that conversation engaging, but we have one hand on the wheel and they have one hand on the wheel. And we have to share that reality. Like we don't have full ownership over it. And so when it comes to like why employers may not leave unstructured time, it's the concept of, usually it comes from like this old inherited middle management structure of, we need people managers, and we manage the people managers. And sometimes, not always, I've had some really great people managers that don't do this, but sometimes there are people managers who wind up defending as their best interest, which is being able to answer a question from their boss quickly of, what's your team doing?
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Hey, where's your team at? Where are we on this process? The worst answer for middle management in there from a perception is I don't know, because you're paid to know what's going on.
Yeah.
But knowing what's going on does not mean knowing every minute of your employee's day.
Yeah.
Right? So like there are different ways to answer that. You can say, hey, qualitatively, I have this. I have a stand-up on Fridays. I'll get you the information on Fridays if you want an update. So there are things, and like, and now that myself, and I've moved into kind of mid-senior level positions, it's like I'm experiencing it from the flip side of being a direct report of, we, as in middle management, shape the culture because we each carry it and influence it through our actions.
Yes.
And so like whether we are doing it right, whether we are supporting a culture of trust and leaving open space, or whether we are closing that down and trying to manage things differently, we're affecting that culture.
I love that you said that culture lives in each employee. That culture is not what you tell an employee to think about your business or your brand. Culture is what they say about you when you're not in the room. Culture is what they think about their workplace when they're not at work. That is what culture is.
It's how you feel on Monday morning when you wake up.
Yes. 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 That reminds me of a Perry Hedrick quote. He said something about culture is how you feel about going to work on a Sunday night on a Monday morning, or something. It's something really similar, and I really like that. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of like nurturing growth through action. So you have such a brilliant mind in terms of how to relate the scientific concepts to real world things. And I think in the past you've said you were trying to relate something to physics, and you were saying something about objects at rest stay at rest, and talking about how you build that forward momentum into building your own career or building growth for yourself.
Yeah. You know, I don't always realize how nerdy I am, but
it's fantastic. I'm a fan of it, so
it's good. No, and I've embraced it too as part of who I am. So yes, there are amazing parallels between fields that you can connect, and this is the benefit of unstructured time, to make the connections.
Yes.
But when I think about physics, about stuck and momentum and all of that, right? Let's think about this metaphor. We always talk about, is there friction? Is there a friction for a customer to buy? Is there friction in my career to progress, right? Friction functions according to rules, right? There are specific rules. And one of the unique things about friction that you can see in the mathematics, and if you test it in a lab, you see it, and like intuitively we know it, but we don't know it if we don't point it out, is there are two types of friction. So there is static friction, which is the experience of grip between one object and the surface it's on when it's at rest and you're trying to get it started. And then there's the friction called dynamic friction, which is the resistance to forward motion after an object is already moving.
Okay.
And so the mathematics show that regardless of what circumstance you're in, static friction, the amount of force it takes to get an object moving, is always more than what it takes to keep it moving.
Yes.
Static friction is greater than dynamic friction. I'm sure there's edge cases in like crazy astrophysics, but like in the world we live in, that's the reality. And so I think about friction as individuals, and like our forward, like whether we're trying to sell a product, whether we're trying to have a personal brand moment or growth. If you feel stuck and you can get yourself unstuck, there is no amount of effort you will ever have to exert more than that first step. And if you can do that, that is proof you can sustain that movement forward.
Ooh, say that again. I love that. Say it again.
There is no amount of effort you will have to exert that is more than the initial effort it takes to get unstuck. And
Mm.
by the act of getting unstuck, it is proof you have enough strength of character, of will, to continue forward movement once you are moving.
Okay, I just want everybody else to hear that. Like, if you're feeling stuck, just doing one thing today, one thing that's going to move you in a different direction in your career is proof that you can get unstuck. So if you can make yourself read a different job description or take a personality quiz online or anything, any small step in that direction, Mike is telling you, science says you can do it. You can get unstuck. Okay, so discuss this concept of sort of the opportunity cost of not choosing not to get unstuck. You know, sort of that we always have that need to take that iterative action. So you've talked about, do one thing in that direction. I think this also applies to a lot of the concepts you've talked about in marketing muscle, with building that muscle memory and even just like physically working out, building that muscle. Could you talk a little bit more about that aspect?
Yeah, there is inertia to any brand. And again, I'm going physics, I apologize. But like,
You love this.
yes. So there's inertia to any brand. It's a personal career brand or a brand in a company and you're selling something. And what is inertia if you're not the nerd I am? Inertia is simply, it's a measure of how much momentum something has. It's an intrinsic quantity like weight or height. It's a measure of something. And inertia is the thing that keeps still objects still and it keeps moving objects moving in the absence of things like friction slowing them down.
Mm-hmm.
So generally in speaking, it's the weight, it's how heavy something is. So when you build a brand, in my mind, my random connection is you're adding weight. You're building a heavyweight brand. You're adding clout. You're adding, our language mirrors all of these little tiny things. When you look at the types of like implicit definitions in these words, you're like, that was a heavy piece of content, or wow, that was a hard hitting quote. That is clout, that is power, it's weight, and therefore inertia to a brand. And as you add strength, you add weight to this this inertial piece, it wants to keep moving. So one of the coolest things when it comes to growing is like, especially the personal brand, and you're creating content as the way of kind of doing this. If you think about like something like a heavy disc on a pivot point, like on an axle, right? They call it a flywheel. If you know marketing, flywheel marketing is like a thing, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You get something heavy spinning and it kind of wants to stay spinning. It's momentum, just not in a straight line. It's not a train, it's a circle. But the heavier that is, the longer it will keep spinning after you stop pushing on it. Every piece of content you drive is you spinning that wheel. You put a little piece of content into it. And you're like, if you have a light brand, if you're new, if you don't have established clout yet, and it's very thin, it's a paper plate on a pencil. You spin it, it's like, and it just stops. But over time, you stack up a whole, like you put a hole, it's a hole through a whole ream of paper, and you spin that, and that spins for a while. And then you're like, oh, it's not paper anymore, it's stone. And it's not stone anymore, it's lead, it's iron, it's something heavy. You can then experience the benefit of not having to push that continuously for it to keep spinning. You can take a rest. So, and this happens in car engines, and that's why like car engines, at least not electric engines, but like gas ones, have a flywheel, because there's only so many pistons to put power into keeping the car going. And it'd be silly to have like 70, 80, 90 pistons in a row. The car would be longer than a bus to have an engine that big, right? But with a heavy weight, you don't need as many input moments to keep consistent forward movement. So the heavier the brand that you can build, you're able to maintain consistent action and movement without you having to feel like you're behind the gun. If I don't keep spinning this paper plate on a pencil, it's not going to keep turning. So like that's where you go, where you build clout and power.
I think this speaks to something that I think is so important to note, is that when you're building a brand, personal brand, company brand, anything, it's going to be more work on the front end. And if you can prepare yourself for that challenge and just say like, okay, I'm going to go hard at this for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. I'm going to go as hard as I can. and then we're going to let that momentum build and keep going. But just preparing yourself for that mental load sometimes is all that you need to take that next step. It's hard to know if you feel like this is just going to be how it is forever. And what do you think about
It
that?
connects back to the concept about friction. It's that initial amount of effort is greater than what it will take to sustain there. And it's, we live in the same universe and the same rules apply everywhere, right? So like that getting started with friction is more than to sustain it, is the same mindset we have when you're building a heavy brand. You're going to have to pour yourself into this, I don't know what mold of this flywheel you're building. You're going to have to put in a lot of physical effort and mass to it to get it to be something that can then sustain itself. But you don't have to have input at the same rate forever. And I think recognizing that there should be a return on the effort and the energy that you put in, and knowing how to gauge that along the way. Like if you're stacking paper plates, it's going to take you a lot longer than if you're stacking iron plates on a barbell. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So like that's the thing too, is it's like you have to know that it's not an infinite process of adding weight to your flywheel, or that you're not going to be fighting that getting started friction forever. But you have to make sure that the efforts that you're putting in are strategic, so that it's going to take you way longer to stack up paper plates to get a bar to be heavy versus putting 45-pound plates on it, sort of a thing, right?
Totally. Yes, that's such a great analogy. So we're sort of coming to the end of the time, but there's one particular thing I really just want to glean from you, because I feel like we've gotten so much so far. But I just want you to talk a little bit about your own growth, and maybe give us one example of a time when you were really stuck, what you did to move forward, either in life, in your career, or some sort of analogy in that way.
Yeah. My story would be just the inception of the whole marketing muscle brand. It was an accidental thing. Like I didn't set out to make a hashtag. I like alliteration. So like marketing muscle was fun, but
Yeah.
it came about, I think, as a lot of people had transformation in the early pandemic. I had to all of a sudden go from in office work to at home, and I didn't have a place in my house to do that. The only place I had space was in my gym. So I'm like, I'm going to put a desk in my gym. It'll work. We're only going to be home for 2 weeks. It's going to be fine. Like that was the thought process.
Right. 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. And then like years later, and then I went permanently remote. But like I'm sitting here questioning, my existential mortality with the pandemic in the early phases of it, and my career growth, and being in a job where I'm really trying to reflect on like, where am I going? And I just started sitting here and I started looking over to the gym as I'm being pensive, and I'm like, what I do to grow a brand, marketing that works for companies works for individuals, but the thing that grows brands, it's not really that different than what I'm doing over in weightlifting. Because at the time, I was recovering from a pretty major injury. I had been stuck. I had a gym, but I hadn't been using it because I had a major back injury. And I'm like, what can I do to grow here? And I said, I'm going to break down the goal into steps that are so small that even if I trip over it, I can't help but fall uphill.
Yes.
And I said, I want to get back into the best shape of my life. I can't pick up my child right now because of my injury, but I'm going to do it. And I used to be a competitive weightlifter. So I'm like, how do I do this? I'm like, well, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. and I'm going to work out. But that's too big a goal. I'm going to wake up at 5 and relocate myself to the gym.
Ooh.
And that's my goal. So I had set a yoga mat out, and I put my alarm went off, shoved the earbuds in, cranked the volume up so I didn't disturb anybody. And I went to the gym and I laid down on the yoga mat and I fell asleep face down on the yoga mat. And like, but you know what? Goal achieved, right? Goal achieved.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it again. And the next day I did it again. And the next day I did it and I didn't really fall asleep. I'm like, okay, next step. And I'm like, maybe I'll do some PT. I'll do some physical therapy stuff to help my back. And I was doing arching and stretching and all the things I had to do to help my back. And then each tiny micro step was so small. It was so like infinitesimally. I'm like, okay, well now I'm going to sit on my exercise bike. I'm not even going to bike. I'm just going to sit on it. And I sat on it. And I'm like, okay, my back didn't torture me sitting in this. It's a recumbent bike. It didn't hurt me. So my thing that I learned from this growth moment was, it's not about setting big goals and blindly charging into it with less than 40% of the information. It's not about backtracking and ignoring the fact that you're stuck in the mud and going forward, what you thought was working isn't working.
Mhm.
It's about finding the way to make success almost through like micro experiments a almost guarantee. And if you can get them small, like I bet tomorrow I can wake up and fall asleep on the yoga mat. I bet I can do that.
Yeah, yeah.
But then I did that, and like 30 days later, I was waking up and stretching. 60 days after that, I was doing light dumbbell work. Like 8, 9 months after that, I was actually doing barbell stuff again. And 2 years, 2.5, 3 years later, I'm back to lifting close to some of the best, shape that I have ever been in. And
That's incredible.
it's that sort of thing about growth is that, and for me, I just see it because I lived here in the environment of having my gym and the office in the same space. What you need to do mentally there is the same thing you need to do mentally here in business and career. You have to be willing to approach failure, be willing to break down goals in small ways, and pretty soon you become conditioned to the things that once bothered you. And so the weight never gets any lighter. 5 pounds never weighs less than 5 pounds. Your ability to move it advances. Your maximum effort grows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's so many things. I feel like this could be a whole nother conversation, and we're already at 36 minutes. So we got to wrap this up. But all that means, Mike, is we definitely have to have another show.
I would love to.
I'm going to hold you to it.
I would love to.
So let's just really quick go after these 2 rapid fire questions. So the first one is, what is the most random job that you have ever had?
Oof. Okay, real quick. I'm getting stuck. I have two. I'm oscillating. I have 2 and I'm oscillating. All right.
Okay.
Okay. So crazy random job. At one point in my life, like I said, I worked for a small startup, right? Managing sales and marketing. This was crazy random because it was a farm that was expanding into food production. So like,
Okay.
from all the background I had of like selling consumer goods, I wound up moving into this job where I had to learn everything about agriculture and the value of food to table.
That is so random.
So it was the perfect pivot, and then I applied and I modernized and digitized and I did all the stuff for them. But like that would definitely be topically. It was tempting. It was either that or me working in a woodworking cabinetry shop. I did.
Ooh, both sound very random.
I did that one for another time too.
I love it. I love it. So let's have the last rapid fire question is, what is the worst career advice you have ever gotten?
That one I don't have to think about. So when I first started outside of college, I went into sales selling appliances, right? And it was at a big box retailer. And I remember getting advice there that I had when I had the opportunity to make the jump to working as a wholesale rep of like managing a territory of like selling from the vendor that sold to the home improvement stores. I remember somebody before, they're like, you know what? You really don't want to jump around like this because you're going to lose your compounding raises over time. If you stayed here, imagine what you'd be making in a few years. And it's funny that was so bad because looking back, that home improvement retailer had pay caps that they instituted, that no matter how long you stayed there, eventually you could earn no more than a certain amount in that role. Wow. And they did away with commission. They wound up decommissioning their sales force. So the earning potential went down too. So looking back, they were like, you should have stayed. You could have had more money by now. And I'm like, I'm making like 3-4x what I was there like 4 or 5 years later. Like, no, it's like, I'm not. It was bad advice, and I'm glad I didn't take it.
I'm glad you didn't either. I'm so glad. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, for joining us on this wonderful ride. We've definitely gone over time, but I think all of the information has been definitely worth it and valuable. And thank you so much, Mike, again for joining me. And I hope you all have a great day. Bye, everyone.